Welcome to Eternal Darkness, where nightmares come to life. I'll be your host through these twisted tales tonight. Before we descend into the shadows, remember to like and subscribe to join our growing community of horror enthusiasts. Get comfortable, turn down the lights, and prepare yourself as we begin our journey into the unknown. I never wanted to come back to that part of Arizona, not because I didn't love it. I did. The high desert air, the red cliffs, the way the stars looked like they'd been sewn right into the sky. But some places carry weight, memory, and my grandfather's land in the Navajo Nation had both. Javier and Adrian had been bugging me for weeks. "Bro, we need content," Javier kept saying, shoving a camera in my face. "Canyon de Chelly, slot canyons, abandoned ruins. We'll make a killer doc. Call it Shadows in the Redlands or something." Adrian was more direct. "Come on, Noah, you're Navajo. That's your turf. Doesn't your family own land out there or whatever?" They weren't wrong. My grandparents used to live near Chinle, tucked up near the cliffs just a few miles off Spider Rock. After my grandfather passed, my grandma moved in with her sister in Gallup. The house had been sitting vacant for years now. So yeah, I agreed. Stupid. The sun was already sinking when we crossed onto reservation land, casting long shadows across the scrubby landscape. The light was sharp, orange, cutting across the rocks like fire. My hands tightened on the wheel as memories flooded back. Summers spent learning to track jackrabbits. My grandfather's weathered hands showing me how to read the land. The last gas station before the canyon was run by a man who looked like he hadn't changed his flannel in 2 decades. His eyes narrowed when he spotted our camera gear. "Where you boys headed?" he asked, voice rough as gravel. "Just doing some filming near Spider Rock," Javier said, adjusting his expensive camera. "Documentary stuff." The man froze, his eyes darting to me. Recognition flickered there. He could tell I was Navajo. "That your land?" he asked. "Sort of," I mumbled, suddenly feeling like an outsider in my own heritage. He leaned closer, voice dropping. "Don't go wandering past sundown," he said slowly. "And if you hear whistling at night, don't answer, don't even look." Adrian laughed behind me. "What happens if we whistle back? Skinwalkers come out and do a TikTok dance?" The man didn't crack a smile. His eyes were serious, almost sad. "They mimic. That's how they find you." He didn't say anything else. Just rang us up, bagged our drinks, and watched us leave like he was already mourning. We drove out past the pavement and onto the old service roads. My stomach was tight the whole time. The land looked the same, but wrong, emptier somehow. I hadn't been back in over a decade, and all that silence pressed on me like a weight. "Dude, your hands are shaking," Adrian noticed from the passenger seat. "You okay?" I nodded, but couldn't find words. How could I explain that the deeper we drove into the reservation, the more I felt something watching us? How the familiar landscape of my childhood now seemed alien, threatening. No birds circled overhead. No insects buzzed. Just wind and dust and memories. We camped about a mile east of my grandparents' old house, up on a sandstone ledge overlooking the canyon. The view was incredible until the sun went down. That's when it hit me. Nothing moved. The desert's never truly quiet. There's always something. A beetle. An owl. The rustle of wind through sagebrush. But that night, nothing. Like the land itself was holding its breath. We built a fire and cooked some canned chili. Adrian pulled out a flask. "To forbidden ground and local legends," he toasted. "Don't joke like that," I said. He raised an eyebrow. "What? You believe that crap?" I didn't answer. Truth was, I didn't know what I believed. My grandfather used to tell me stories, not bedtime stories, warnings. He said there were things out there that weren't meant to be seen. That if you ever heard a voice calling your name from the dark and it sounded like someone you loved, you should run. I used to laugh at that, but not that night. Javier was reviewing footage on his camera. These canyon shots are insane. The light here. He trailed off, engrossed in his viewfinder. I stared into the darkness beyond our camp. The firelight only reached so far, creating a small island of visibility surrounded by absolute blackness. The stars above were brilliant, cold, and distant. You know what they say about skinwalkers, right? Adrian continued, clearly enjoying my discomfort. They're witches who killed their own family members to gain power. They wear animal skins to transform. Shut up, man, I said, more sharply than I intended. I'm just saying, if there's something out there, there's nothing out there, I interrupted, not believing my own words. Just respect the place, okay? My grandfather would have wanted that. We climbed into the tent sometime after midnight. Adrian passed out quickly, the whiskey doing its work. Javier fell asleep scrolling through photos on his camera, but I lay awake, listening. Around 2:11 a.m., I woke up in a cold sweat. I didn't know why at first. The fire had burned down to embers. Javier and Adrian were passed out in their sleeping bags, their faces lit red from the coals. Then I heard it. A whistle. Not a tune, just one long, slow rising note, like someone was testing their breath. It came from the east, then another answered from the west, then silence. I didn't move. Not an inch. I pulled the sleeping bag tighter and prayed it would stop. It didn't. After a few minutes, it started again, but this time it was closer. The pitch was off, just slightly. Like someone trying to copy the sound of a human whistle but getting the shape of the lips wrong. I could hear it bouncing off the cliffs, but I couldn't pin it down. Then came the voice. Noah. It was barely above a whisper. Noah, boy, it's cold out here. I felt every muscle in my body contract at once. That was my grandfather's voice, no question. Same rhythm, same gravelly tone. The way he used to wake me up for morning chores. But he died in 2015. Open the tent, son. I stayed frozen, breathing through my nose, trying not to shake. The zipper didn't move. Neither did Adrian or Javier. Just me, locked in place while something outside pretended to be family. After a minute, I found the courage to unzip the flap just enough to peek outside. There was nothing there. Just the dying fire, just rock and dust. I was about to lay back down when I noticed something strange about the firelight. The shadows were moving in the wrong direction, like something was blocking the light just out of frame. I swung the flashlight toward the ridge. That's when I saw it. A figure, crouched low, like it was squatting. Its arms hung longer than they should have, nearly to the ground. The face, I couldn't make it out, just the suggestion of it. But it was watching us, watching me. I shut the tent, locked the zipper, pressed my back against the fabric, and sat there until morning. When the sun came up, it found me still sitting like that, pale and silent. Adrian groaned and asked why I hadn't gone to sleep. I didn't answer. Javier was reviewing some of his nighttime long exposures and paused suddenly. He turned the screen toward me. There, in the top corner of the frame, perched on the ledge like a gargoyle, was the thing I saw. The silhouette, still and hunched. You could almost make out hands pressed to its face like it was watching through binoculars made of its fingers. I don't remember speaking, but apparently I muttered something under my breath. That's not a man. We didn't talk much that morning. Javier kept zooming in on that photo over and over again, like he could force it to make sense. Adrian said it was probably a trick of the light, or maybe someone messing with us, but he didn't sound convinced. Not really. I told them we needed to leave. I'm serious, I said. Something's wrong. This isn't a joke. Adrian rolled his eyes. Dude, you're just freaked out because you saw a shadow. Come on, you've been telling us spooky stories since we got here. Now you're buying into them. Javier didn't say anything. He just kept staring at the screen. We moved camp anyway, packed everything in silence, drove another few miles down into a shallow canyon, and pitched our tents near an old dry riverbed out of sight from the cliffs. I didn't tell them why I picked that spot. I just knew it was far from where we saw that thing. The second we got the fire going, I stepped away and gathered some ash from the pit. I mixed it with cedar bark and a pinch of cornmeal from a pouch I'd carried in my bag since I was a kid. My grandmother used to do this when I was sick or scared, marking circles around beds, doorways, windows. A barrier. A prayer. Adrian watched me from his camping chair. What the hell are you doing now? Don't break this, I said, drawing the circle carefully around the tent. I'm serious, Adrian. You don't want to invite anything in. He laughed like he always did, but it sounded forced this time. Fine. Vibe circle, whatever. Javier was quieter, setting up his camera on a tripod aimed at the ridge. I'm running an infrared time-lapse tonight, he said, voice flat. Just to see what's out there. The sun sank quickly, as if eager to abandon us. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in minutes. We huddled around the fire, the darkness pressing in from all sides. We should tell stories, Adrian suggested, trying to lighten the mood. Isn't that what people do around campfires? No, I said immediately. No stories, not here. Javier nodded in agreement. Let's just be quiet. We sat in silence, the fire popping occasionally. I watched the protective circle I'd drawn, praying it would hold against whatever was out there. Adrian broke first. Okay, this is stupid. We're sitting here scared of nothing. There's a perfectly logical explanation for what we saw. Like what? I asked. I don't know. A coyote? A homeless guy? Maybe some reservation kids messing with the tourists? That wasn't human, Javier said quietly. Whatever I caught on camera, the proportions were wrong. Adrian stood up. I'm going to bed. You two can stay up all night freaking yourselves out if you want. We didn't hear the whistling that night. We heard something worse. It started with a smell. Around midnight, the air shifted. It was cold already, but this was something different. Like opening a freezer and getting hit in the face with spoiled meat. Rotten wet fur. It came in waves. Then came the noise. Scratching. It was faint. Barely there, but distinct. Like claws against fabric. It moved around the tent slowly. I held my breath. Adrian was silent too. Then it sniffed. I swear to God. It sniffed the tent wall, right next to my head. Long, heavy breaths, like it was tasting our scent. I didn't move. Neither did Adrian. A moment passed, then another. Then I heard Javier whisper from his side of the tent. Guys, there's someone out there. They're looking at me. He sounded choked, afraid in a way I'd never heard before. I started to unzip the tent just a little, just enough to peek out. But something beat me to it. A shadow passed across the mesh. A shape, upright but bent. Its hands dragged across the fabric as it moved, slow and deliberate. Its fingers were too long. I backed away and grabbed my flashlight. The second I turned it on, everything stopped. No wind, no movement, no sound. Then from the tree line, just past the fire, came a voice. Noah, boy! I felt every hair on my body stand up. It wasn't my grandfather this time. It was me. My voice, but wrong, hollow, like someone had recorded it and played it back through broken speakers. Then it said Adrian's name. Then Javier's. In every voice but our own. Javier, come see. You're not scared, are you? The voice laughed. I turned to Javier. He was pale, sweating, gripping his camera like a weapon. I saw it, he said. It was wearing my face. What? In the trees just standing there. I saw its eyes. It smiled like me, Noah. But the mouth, it went too far. Adrian snapped. Okay, enough of this. This is ridiculous. We're sitting here scared of the woods like kids. I'm gonna take a piss and come back, and you two better have grown a pair. Don't leave the circle, I said quickly. Adrian, don't break the circle. But he was already stepping through it. He muttered something about not being afraid of ghost stories and vanished into the dark. I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab him and pull him back, but I didn't. The second he stepped out, the fire flickered. Then we heard it. Running. Not human running. Animalistic. Too fast, circling. Javier gripped my arm. Do you hear that? Adrian came back into view, pale, wide-eyed, frozen. I think something's out there, he said, barely above a whisper. I felt it watching me. Then we heard a dry, rattling breath just behind him. I aimed the flashlight, and what we saw did not belong to this world. A figure hunched low, crawling fast on all fours. But the joints bent the wrong way, like a puppet with broken strings. Its back arched unnaturally, spine visible through its mottled skin. And when it stopped and stood, it unfolded like a spider standing upright. It had a face, a stretched, leathery face. But it was wearing it, not owning it. Sewn around its own twisted features, it smiled, and then it spoke in Javier's voice. Come on, man, it's just a joke. I dragged Adrian back inside the circle. We piled sleeping bags, gear, and even the cooler in front of the tent's zipper. Then we heard a new sound. Zip. The tent was unzipping. From the outside. I shoved my hand forward, flashlight in one hand, knife in the other. In the split-second glimpse through the half-open tent flap, I saw fingers, long, clawed, dirty, and bent backward, feeling along the zipper like it was learning what it was. Then Javier screamed. Not inside the tent, outside. We burst out, but he was gone. Just gone. No struggle, no blood, no noise. Just his camera lying on the dirt, still recording. Adrian picked it up with shaking hands. We watched the footage right there, using the back screen. It showed Javier sitting alone, looking toward the trees. Then a figure stepped into frame behind him. Not walked, crawled, like a lizard, down a tree, head first. Its arms reached out, then folded Javier into them like he was nothing. He didn't fight. He just vanished into the dark. And then the camera turned on its own and showed the face. Javier's face, grinning, wrong, stretched too wide. And then the feed cut out. We didn't speak. We didn't cry. We just packed what we could and started walking. We didn't know where. Just away. I never told Adrian what I saw in the firelight just before we left. Just past the ashes of the broken circle, there were hoof prints, barefoot tracks, and drag marks, and written in the ash, in crooked block letters, "Let us in." We didn't stop walking until the sun came up. No sleep, no food, no plan. Just the two of us, me and Adrian, hauling what was left of our gear through miles of empty scrubland, hoping we'd hit a road or see headlights or something that didn't have a face sewn from someone we used to know. Javier was gone, and I wasn't even sure he died. That somehow made it worse. I tried to keep my mind moving, tried to focus on distance, direction, anything. But Adrian was breaking. He wasn't talking, not really, just muttering to himself, replaying the footage on Javier's camera over and over, even though the battery had died hours ago. It had his face, he kept saying. It was wearing his fucking face. The morning light revealed the landscape around us, red rocks, sparse vegetation, the vast emptiness of the desert. But it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt crowded, like eyes were watching from every shadow, every crevice. "We need to find help," I said, though I had no idea where to look. Cell service had been non-existent since we arrived. Adrian stopped suddenly, staring ahead. "Noah," he whispered, pointing. There, in the distance, was our SUV. All 4 doors were wide open. "How?" Adrian's voice cracked. "We parked miles from here." As we approached, I saw that the inside was gutted, ripped apart like a coyote had gotten into it, except there were no paw prints, just long bare feet in the dust. And something else. Hooves. Small ones. The kind you'd expect on a goat. Or a fawn, but spaced wrong, too far apart, like something bipedal wearing the wrong skin. The seats had been clawed up. My backpack was open. Every item inside arranged in a neat little pile across the windshield, like it was studying us, like it knew what mattered. The driver's side window had a message scratched into the glass from the inside. "We follow your voice." I dropped the keys. They wouldn't matter anyway. The battery was stone dead. "We're being hunted," I said flatly. "It's not just trying to scare us. It wants us lost alone." Adrian nodded, still blank-faced, hollow-eyed. I remembered something my grandfather told me when I was 9, that if you're being followed by something not of this world, you don't go home. You don't run straight. You don't give it a trail to follow. Instead, you head to where the old spirits sleep. That's when I remembered the Hogan. The Hogan was built by my grandfather's grandfather, half buried in the canyon near the old shepherd paths. He used to take me there sometimes when I was a kid. It was sacred, untouched, maybe even protected. "We need to go there," I told Adrian, pointing toward a distant ridge. "There's a place, a safe place." Adrian didn't question me. He just nodded, eyes scanning the horizon nervously. "Will it follow us?" "Yes," I said, not sugarcoating it. "But we might have a chance there." The sun climbed higher, beating down on us as we trudged across the harsh terrain. My mouth was dry, lips cracking. We had 1 bottle of water between us, and I was trying to make it last. Adrian kept looking over his shoulder. "Do you feel that?" I did, the weight of eyes on our backs. The sense that we were being allowed to walk, not escaping. "Just keep moving," I said. "Don't look back." The farther we got into the canyon, the quieter it became. No birds, no wind. Not even our footsteps made much sound anymore. Like the rocks were listening. Around noon, we started hearing them again. Our own voices. From behind the rocks, from the ridges above us. Always just far enough that we couldn't see where they were coming from. "Adrian, you left me, bro." "Noah. It's Javier. I'm okay. I just need help." But there was no echo, no weight to the words. They floated. Hollow. Adrian broke first. He turned sharply and screamed into the rocks. "Shut up, you're not him!" The canyon responded in perfect mimicry. "Shut up, you're not him." Same tone, same rage, same pitch, but higher, like a child mocking its parent. That's when the rocks started falling. Not a landslide, just a warning. Something was above us. I grabbed Adrian's arm. "Don't engage with it. That's what it wants." His eyes were wild, unfocused. "I can't do this, Noah. I can't." "Yes, you can," I cut him off. "Think about Javier. We need to make it out to tell someone what happened." That seemed to center him. He nodded, took a deep breath. We continued deeper into the canyon. The walls rose around us, casting long shadows that seemed to move independently of the sun's position. The air grew thick, almost difficult to breathe. From somewhere in the distance came a sound like laughing children, but distorted, stretched out. "What is that?" Adrian whispered. "Don't listen," I said, but I was listening too. The laughter shifted, morphed into something that sounded like a wounded animal, then back to laughter. As we rounded a bend in the canyon, I saw something that made my heart skip. There, on the rock wall, were handprints. Dozens of them in red ochre. Ancient Navajo markings. "We're close," I said, feeling a surge of hope. "The Hogan's just beyond that ridge." The handprints watched us pass. I could almost feel them reaching for us, warning us. Adrian suddenly stopped, his eyes fixed on something ahead. "Noah," he said, his voice barely audible. "Look." Standing in the center of the path was a deer. Perfectly still. Its eyes reflected nothing, two black voids staring back at us. And its legs, they bent the wrong way. "Don't move," I whispered. The deer's head twitched, neck cracking as it turned at an impossible angle. Its mouth opened, wider than any deer's mouth should, and from it came Javier's voice. "Guys, wait for me." Adrian stumbled backward. The deer took a step forward, its hooves leaving human-like footprints in the dust. "Run," I said, and we did, sprinting past the creature as it began to shed its skin, revealing something dark and glistening beneath. We ran until our lungs burned, until the canyon walls blurred around us. Behind us, something gave chase. I could hear it scrambling over rocks, its breathing ragged and wet. Then, as we crested a small rise, I saw it. The Hogan. We reached the Hogan by late afternoon. It was half buried into the side of a slope, its door sealed with thick planks, the red clay walls covered in faded symbols. Navajo protection glyphs. Some scratched away, some still strong. I pushed the door open and nearly wept. Inside it smelled like cedar and sage, dusty but untouched. In the center there was a small circle of black ash, intact. We dropped everything and sat inside it. I grabbed the old satchel from the altar shelf, my grandfather's pouch of blessed ash and turquoise chips, and kept it clutched tight in my hands like it was the only real thing left in the world. "What is this place?" Adrian asked, looking around in wonder at the small, dome-shaped structure. "A sacred dwelling," I explained, running my hand along the smooth clay wall. "My family has kept this place for generations. It's protected." Adrian nodded, not understanding, but accepting. He was past questioning anything at this point. I began to explain the significance of the Hogan, how it was built with the door facing east to welcome the morning sun, how the smoke hole in the center connected us to the sky. But my words trailed off as the air outside turned thick, like we were being suffocated by silence. Then came the knock. 3 times, slow, rhythmic, like it had all the time in the world. I held my breath. Another knock, but it came from the opposite side of the Hogan now. Then another, above us, on the roof. Adrian whimpered. "It's surrounding us." "No," I whispered. "It is us. It's inside our heads." Then the voice came, right outside the door. Javier's voice. "Noah, open up, man. I'm hurt." Silence. Then it came again. From behind us this time. "Please, it's so dark out here. Don't leave me out here." I stood, stepped toward the door. Adrian grabbed my arm. "Don't." "I'm not," I said. "I think it knows it's losing." Outside it growled. Not like a bear, not like a coyote. Something deep and wet, like breath caught in a throat too long. The voice changed. "Noah." It wasn't Javier anymore. It was my grandfather. "Open the door, son. We need to bury you." My knees buckled. Then something slammed against the wall so hard it shook the dirt from the ceiling. Then again, the door cracked. Wood splintered. It was coming in. I ripped open the satchel, grabbed the ash, whispered the only prayer I could remember. My DNA was rusty, but I spoke it anyway with everything I had. And when the door shattered and the thing crawled in, I saw its real face. It had none. Just raw sinew. Holes for eyes. A mouth that stretched and warped and split open as it screamed. But its scream was layered. Dozens of voices all at once, like a choir of the dead. I threw the ash in its face. It hit like acid. It screeched, a sound so sharp it made my ears bleed, and burst into fire without flame. A white-hot flash that lit the Hogan like a furnace. It didn't run. It crawled out backwards, screaming all the way, bones snapping, skin tearing off as it went. Then it was gone, and the silence returned. Adrian was huddled in the corner, hands over his ears, eyes squeezed shut. I crawled to him, put a hand on his shoulder. "It's gone," I said. "For now." He looked up at me, eyes red-rimmed. "What was that thing?" I shook my head. "Something old. Something that doesn't belong in this world anymore." We sat in silence as darkness fell outside. The ash circle in the center of the Hogan seemed to glow faintly, a barrier between us and what waited beyond the broken door. I told Adrian what my grandfather had taught me, that there were things in this world that hungered for human form, human voice. That they could wear your skin, your memories, if you let them in. "Will it come back?" he asked. "Yes," I said, "but not tonight. The Hogan will hold." As we settled in for the night, Adrian finally fell into an exhausted sleep. But I stayed awake, watching the doorway, listening to the night sounds return. An owl, wind through juniper, normal sounds. The world was balancing itself again. But as I drifted towards sleep, I heard a whisper, not from outside, from inside my own head. "Noah, we're still here." The sun rose like it had no idea what had happened. Golden light spilled through the broken door of the Hogan, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Adrian was curled up in the ashes, still sleeping. I was standing on the ridge above the Hogan, staring at nothing. I'd gone outside as dawn broke, needing to breathe, to feel something normal. The desert stretched out before me, beautiful and indifferent. No sign of what had hunted us. No tracks, no blood, nothing. But I could feel it. A thinness in the air. Like the barrier between worlds had been stretched too far and hadn't quite snapped back into place. I heard footsteps behind me and turned to see Adrian climbing up to join me. His face was haggard, eyes sunken with exhaustion. "You okay?" he asked. I almost laughed. "No." He nodded. "Yeah, me neither." We stood in silence, watching the landscape wake up. A hawk circled overhead. Insects buzzed. Normal things. "We need to find a way out of here," Adrian said eventually. "Find help." "For what?" I asked. "For Javier?" The question hung between us. What could we possibly tell anyone? Who would believe us? "I just want to go home," Adrian said, his voice cracking. "I know," I said. "Me too." We gathered what little we had left and started walking. The GPS on Adrian's phone was dead, but I had a general sense of direction. If we headed east, we'd eventually hit a main road. The day grew hot quickly. Sweat soaked through my shirt, but I felt cold inside. Empty. Like something had been scooped out of me. Adrian was talking more now, planning what we'd say when we found help. A story about getting lost. About Javier wandering off. A normal, believable tragedy. I let him talk. It seemed to keep him together. Around midday, we heard the distant sound of an engine. We froze, then started running toward it. Over a rise, we saw a ranger vehicle driving slowly along a dirt road. We shouted, waved our arms. The vehicle stopped. The ranger who stepped out looked us over with concern. Two dehydrated, terrified young men appearing out of nowhere. "You boys okay?" he asked. Adrian started our practice story immediately. We were filming a documentary. Got separated from our friend. Spent the night lost. The ranger radioed for help, gave us water. Everything happened quickly after that. More rangers, questions, search parties organized for Javier. I went through the motions, answering questions mechanically. Yes, we were filming. No, we didn't see where he went. Yes, we spent the night in an old structure. They didn't ask about the fear in our eyes, about why we jumped at shadows, about why I kept checking behind the ranger as he spoke to us. By evening, we were in a ranger station. They'd given us food, more water, blankets. Adrian was talking to someone about filing a missing persons report. I sat alone, staring at the wall. I felt hollow, disconnected. Like I wasn't quite back in the real world yet. A shadow fell across me, and I looked up to see an older Navajo man standing there. He wasn't in uniform. Something about his eyes reminded me of my grandfather. "You went to the old places," he said. Not a question. I nodded. "And you brought something back." My heart stuttered. "What do you mean?" He didn't answer directly. Instead, he handed me a small pouch, similar to the one I'd used in the Hogan. "Keep this close," he said. "Don't speak its name. Don't acknowledge it. It will fade." Before I could ask more, he was gone. Just a retreat of footsteps and the closing of a door. I opened the pouch. Inside was ash, sage, and a small carved stone figure. Protection. Adrian came back looking drained. "They're sending out search teams at first light, but they don't sound hopeful. They won't find him," I said. Adrian didn't argue. He knew. Javier's body was never found. We gave them the story they expected. We got lost. Javier wandered off. We panicked. That was it. They didn't push. The wilderness was vast. People disappeared in it all the time. Adrian deleted the footage. Every file. Every photo. He said he couldn't bear to look at it, but I knew the truth. He was afraid of what might look back. We flew home 3 days later. Adrian didn't talk much on the flight. He stared out the window, flinching occasionally at nothing. When we landed, he hugged me tightly, then disappeared into the crowd at baggage claim. I never saw him again. His social media went dark a month later. His phone was disconnected. When I went to his apartment, a different family answered the door. They said they'd been living there for weeks. I moved back in with my grandmother in Gallup and spent the next 3 weeks in ceremony. Cleansing, fasting, burning prayers into cedar wood. She didn't ask what happened. She just looked at me one night and said, "You brought something back with you." I asked what she meant. She pointed to my shadow on the wall. It was still, even when I moved. "Some things don't just wear your skin," she said quietly. "They wear your voice, your memories, and if you're not careful, they wear you." I still dream about the canyon, about what happened there. In my dreams, I'm running through endless red rock corridors, pursued by something that calls my name in every voice I've ever loved. Sometimes I wake up to find dirt on my sheets, sand in my shoes, no memory of where I've been. Last week, I found myself standing in front of the mirror at 3 a.m. with no recollection of how I got there. For just a second, my reflection smiled before I did. I don't go out at night anymore. I don't answer when someone calls my name unless I can see their face. I keep my grandfather's pouch around my neck, refreshing the contents daily. But sometimes, when I'm alone, I hear whistling. A single note, rising slowly. Testing. And sometimes, God help me, I want to whistle back. Because here's the truth I haven't told anyone. Part of me is still out there, in that canyon, with whatever took Javier, whatever wears my shadow, and it's patient, so patient, waiting for me to let it. The incident occurred in the summer of 2018. I was 31 then, and my boyfriend James was 33. We had been dating for 3 years, and this was meant to be our first romantic getaway to my family's cabin in northwestern Ontario. The timing couldn't have been more perfect. We had both managed to secure the same week off from our demanding jobs in Toronto, a rare occurrence that we decided to celebrate with a retreat to the wilderness. The cabin sits on a small island in Lake Mistral, roughly 45 minutes by a winding gravel road from the nearest town of Thornbury. The property has been in my family for over 60 years, passed down from my grandfather who built it himself in 1958. 23 cabins dot the shoreline of the lake, but they're spread so far apart that you can barely see your neighbors through the thick wall of pine, spruce, and birch trees that surround the water. The drive north was peaceful enough. James had never been this far into the Canadian wilderness, and I found myself playing tour guide, pointing out landmarks and sharing childhood memories. But as we turned onto the final stretch of road leading to the boat launch, I noticed something that made my stomach tighten. The usual summer bustle was absent. The parking area that should have been dotted with vehicles was nearly empty. Just 2 dusty pickup trucks and a rusted sedan that looked like it hadn't moved in weeks. "Where is everyone?" James asked, voicing my own concern. "It's Wednesday," I replied, though I wasn't entirely convinced by my own explanation. "Most people only come up on weekends." The boat launch itself felt wrong. The wooden dock, weathered gray by decades of harsh winters, creaked ominously under our feet as we loaded our supplies into the aluminum boat. The water was unusually still, like black glass reflecting the overcast sky. Not even the slightest ripple disturbed the surface, and the silence was so complete it felt oppressive. As I pulled the engine starter cord, the motor's roar seemed to echo endlessly across the water, bouncing off the surrounding hills with an intensity that made both of us wince. The sound felt like an intrusion, a violation of something sacred and untouched. James gripped the sides of the boat as I navigated through the narrow channel between 2 small islands, his knuckles white against the worn aluminum. "God, it's quiet out here," he muttered, his voice barely audible over the engine. I nodded, but something deeper was bothering me. In all my years coming to this lake, I had never experienced this level of emptiness. There should have been loons calling, fish jumping, the distant sound of other boats. Instead, there was nothing but the mechanical drone of our engine and the gentle lap of water against the hull. The island came into view as we rounded the final bend. Our cabin, a modest A-frame structure with a wraparound deck, sat perched on a small hill overlooking the water. It should have been a welcoming sight, but something about its dark windows and motionless surroundings made it appear almost abandoned. The dock, usually sun-bleached and warm, looked gray and uninviting in the dim afternoon light. As we tied up the boat and began unloading our gear, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being observed. The tree line, thick with decades of growth, seemed to press closer to the cabin than I remembered. Dark gaps between the trunks created pockets of shadow so deep they appeared solid, impenetrable. I found myself glancing repeatedly at these spaces, expecting to see movement, but finding only more darkness. "You okay?" James asked, noticing my distraction. "Just tired from the drive," I lied, shouldering my backpack and heading up the steep path to the cabin. The key was hidden in its usual spot under the loose board on the deck. As I unlocked the door and stepped inside, the musty smell of a building that had been closed up for months hit me immediately. It was a familiar scent, a mixture of old wood, lake air, and the faint smokiness that never quite left the stone fireplace. But underneath these expected odors, there was something else, something organic and unsettling that I couldn't quite identify. James appeared behind me, arms loaded with supplies. "Smells like my grandmother's attic," he said with a nervous laugh. I forced a smile and opened the windows to let in fresh air, but the breeze that entered felt cold despite the warm afternoon temperature. As I worked to air out the cabin, I noticed several things that struck me as odd. There were scratches on the windowsill of the main room that I didn't remember from previous visits. Long, parallel marks that looked almost like claw marks. The screen door had a tear in it that definitely wasn't there last season. Most disturbing of all, there were what appeared to be large footprints in the soft earth around the cabin's foundation, though they were too weathered to make out any distinct details. Probably just a bear, I told myself, but the prints seemed too large, too human-like in their stride pattern. We spent the rest of the afternoon settling in, unpacking our clothes, and preparing dinner. James seemed to relax as we fell into the routine of cabin life, but I remained on edge. Every creak of the old building, every rustle of leaves outside, every distant sound from the lake made me pause and listen. The isolation that had always been one of my favorite aspects of this place now felt threatening. As evening approached, the temperature dropped significantly. This was unusual for July, but I convinced myself it was just a cold front moving through. We built a fire in the stone fireplace and settled in for our first night, playing cards and sharing stories. James seemed genuinely happy, and I tried to mirror his mood, but I couldn't stop glancing at the dark windows. Around 11 o'clock, as we were preparing for bed, I heard it for the first time. A low, guttural sound that seemed to come from somewhere deep in the woods. It lasted only a few seconds, but it was unlike anything I had ever heard before. Not quite an animal sound, but not human either. Something in between. "What was that?" James asked, his card game forgotten. "Probably just a loon," I said quickly, though I knew it wasn't. Loons have a distinctive call that I had grown up hearing. This was something else entirely. We finished our game in relative silence, both of us straining to hear any repetition of the sound. When none came, we convinced ourselves it had been our imagination, or perhaps a distant truck on the mainland road. But as we settled into our beds in the back room, I found myself lying awake, listening to every sound the night offered. The cabin fell silent except for the gentle lapping of water against the dock and the occasional creak of settling wood. James's breathing soon deepened into the steady rhythm of sleep, but rest would not come for me. Something was wrong with this place, something that went beyond the usual isolation and wilderness sounds I had grown accustomed to over the years. Outside, the darkness seemed absolute. Even with my eyes adjusted to the gloom, I could see nothing beyond the bedroom window. The blackness was so complete it felt solid, as if someone had hung a thick curtain just inches from the glass. I lay there for what felt like hours, my ears straining for any sound that might explain the growing dread that had settled in my chest. It was nearly 2 a.m. when I finally drifted off to sleep, but my dreams were filled with images of shapes moving through the trees, of eyes watching from the darkness, and of that strange, impossible sound echoing endlessly through the forest. Thursday morning arrived gray and humid, with low clouds hanging over the lake like a wet blanket. I woke feeling unrested, my body aching as if I had been running all night. James was already up, standing at the kitchen window with a cup of coffee, looking out at the water. "Sleep well?" he asked, though something in his voice suggested he already knew the answer. "Not really," I admitted, joining him at the window. "You?" "I kept hearing things," he said quietly. "Probably just the wind, but—" He didn't finish the sentence, but he didn't need to. I had heard them too. Soft sounds that might have been footsteps circling the cabin, the creak of the deck boards as if someone was testing each one carefully, the whisper of something moving through the tall grass that surrounded our clearing. The lake appeared different in the morning light. The water, which had been mirror-smooth the evening before, now showed signs of disturbance. Concentric circles rippled outward from various points, as if large objects had recently broken the surface. But there were no fish jumping, no ducks or other waterfowl that might explain the disturbance. "Maybe we should head back to town today," James suggested, his usual enthusiasm for outdoor adventures notably absent. I considered this seriously. Everything about this trip felt wrong, from the empty lake to the strange sounds to the growing sense that we were not alone on the island. But I had been looking forward to this getaway for months, and the rational part of my mind insisted that we were simply letting our imaginations run wild. "Let's give it one more day," I said finally. "If we still feel weird about it tonight, we can leave in the morning." James nodded, but I could see the reluctance in his eyes. We decided to spend the day exploring the island, hoping that daylight and activity would dispel the unease that had settled over us. After breakfast, we packed a small lunch and set out on the network of overgrown trails that crisscrossed the island. The paths, which I had hiked countless times as a child, felt different now. Narrower somehow, more enclosed. The trees seemed to lean inward, their branches creating a canopy so thick that little sunlight reached the forest floor. The usual sounds of woodland life, bird songs, the chatter of squirrels, the rustle of small creatures in the underbrush, were absent. It was as if the entire ecosystem had gone into hiding. 20 minutes into our hike, we came across the first sign that we were not alone. Pressed into a patch of soft earth beside the trail was a footprint unlike anything I had ever seen. It was roughly the size and shape of a human foot, but longer and wider, with what appeared to be claw marks at the tips of the toes. The print was fresh, probably made within the last day or two. "Bear?" James asked, though his voice lacked conviction. I knelt down for a closer look, comparing the print to my own foot. It was at least twice as large and showed a stride pattern that suggested bipedal movement. Bears occasionally walk on their hind legs, but this print was too human-like for that explanation to satisfy me. "I don't think so," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. We found 3 more prints over the next 100 yards, each one clearer than the last. The final print was so detailed that I could make out individual toe marks and what appeared to be a heel impression. Whatever had made these tracks was heavy, probably weighing well over 200 pounds, and it had been moving deliberately along the same path we were now following. The trail led us to the highest point on the island, a rocky outcrop that offered a view of the entire lake and the surrounding forest. From this vantage point, we could see the other cabins scattered around the shoreline, but not a single one showed signs of occupancy. No boats at the docks, no lights in the windows, no smoke from chimneys. The entire lake appeared to be deserted except for us. "This is wrong," James said, voicing what we were both thinking. "Where is everyone?" I had no answer. In all my years coming to this lake, I had never seen it so completely empty. Even during the off-season, there were usually a few year-round residents who maintained their properties. The absence of any human activity felt ominous, as if everyone else knew something we didn't. We ate our lunch in silence, both of us scanning the tree line for any sign of movement. The forest remained still, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Several times, I caught glimpses of what might have been a large shape moving between the trees, but each time I looked directly at the spot, there was nothing there. "We should go back," I said finally, the words coming out more forcefully than I had intended. James didn't argue. We packed up our remaining food and began the descent back to the cabin. But as we walked, I became increasingly aware that we were not alone on the trail. Behind us, perhaps 50 yards back, something was following. I could hear the soft pad of footsteps that seemed to match our pace, stopping when we stopped, resuming when we continued. I grabbed James's arm and whispered, "Don't look back, but I think something is following us." His body tensed, and I could see him fighting the urge to turn around. We increased our pace, but the footsteps behind us quickened as well. Whatever was back there was making no effort to hide its presence now. The sounds were deliberate, almost taunting. When we reached the cabin, we both ran the last 50 yards, not stopping until we were safely inside with the door locked behind us. Only then did we risk looking back toward the trail. The forest edge was empty, but the grass leading to the tree line was disturbed, as if something large had recently passed through it. "What do you think it was?" James asked, his face pale. I didn't answer because I didn't want to voice the terrifying possibility that was forming in my mind. Whatever had been following us was not a bear or any other animal I was familiar with. It was something else, something that moved with intelligence and purpose, something that understood it was hunting us. We spent the rest of the afternoon inside the cabin, periodically checking the windows for any sign of movement in the tree line. The silence outside was complete, more oppressive than any sound could have been. It felt like the calm before a storm, a held breath before something terrible happened. As evening approached, I began to consider James's earlier suggestion that we leave. Every instinct I possessed was screaming at me to get off this island, to put as much distance as possible between us and whatever was lurking in those woods. But the boat was tied up at the dock, and the idea of walking down that exposed path in the growing darkness felt even more terrifying than staying put. We'll leave first thing in the morning, I promised James, and myself, as soon as there's enough light to navigate safely. But as the sun set and darkness began to creep across the lake, I had a sinking feeling that morning might be too late. Despite our growing unease, we decided to venture to the mainland the next day. The boat ride across the lake felt different from our arrival. The water, which had been glass smooth, now showed an odd choppiness despite the absence of wind. James handled the motor while I sat in the bow, constantly scanning the shoreline for any sign of movement. "Look at that," James called out, pointing to a stretch of beach near the boat launch. Long gouges in the sand led from the water's edge into the tree line, as if something massive had been dragged from the lake. The marks were too large and too deliberate to be natural, and they appeared fresh. Whatever had made them had done so recently, possibly during the night while we had been trying to sleep. We tied up the boat at the mainland dock with unusual care, making sure it was secure enough to withstand any disturbance. The parking area, which had been nearly empty when we arrived, was now completely deserted. The 2 pickup trucks and rusted sedan were gone, leaving only oil stains and tire tracks in the gravel. "Where did everyone go?" James asked, his voice tight with anxiety. I had no answer. It was as if the entire area had been evacuated while we slept. The absence of other people felt wrong, unnatural. Even the most remote locations usually showed some signs of human presence: tire tracks, cigarette butts, discarded food wrappers. Here, there was nothing. We found the old logging road about half a mile from the boat launch, just as I remembered it from childhood visits. The entrance was partially blocked by a rusted gate that hung open on broken hinges. A weathered sign warned that the road was closed to vehicular traffic, but it said nothing about foot traffic. The road itself was in worse condition than I remembered. What had once been a gravel surface was now largely overgrown with weeds and small saplings. Deep ruts filled with stagnant water created obstacles every few hundred yards. The forest pressed in on both sides, creating a tunnel effect that blocked out most of the sky. "Are you sure this is safe?" James asked as we began our hike. "I used to come here as a kid," I replied, though I wasn't entirely convinced by my own words. "It's just an old logging road. People use it for berry picking." But as we walked deeper into the woods, I began to question my childhood memories. The road seemed to stretch much further than I remembered, and the forest on either side appeared denser, more impenetrable. The usual sounds of wildlife were absent, replaced by an oppressive silence that made our footsteps seem unnaturally loud. After an hour of hiking, we came across the first sign that we were not alone. A massive tree had fallen across the road, its trunk easily 4 feet in diameter. But this wasn't natural deadfall. The tree showed clear signs of having been deliberately pushed over. The root system was intact, and the trunk had been positioned in a way that completely blocked the path. "Storm damage," James suggested, though his voice lacked conviction. I examined the tree more closely. There were no other signs of storm activity. No broken branches, no debris, no damage to the surrounding trees. This single tree had been toppled with surgical precision, as if someone or something had wanted to block access to the road. We managed to climb over the fallen trunk and continue our hike. But the incident had shaken both of us. The road beyond the tree was in even worse condition, with deep gouges in the earth that looked like they had been made by something heavy being dragged along the ground. 2 hours into our hike, we found a small clearing where we decided to stop for lunch. The space was roughly circular, surrounded by towering pines that blocked out most of the sky. In the center of the clearing was a ring of blackened stones that had obviously been used as a fire pit, though it looked like it hadn't been active for years. As we ate our sandwiches, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. Around the perimeter of the clearing, scratched into the bark of several trees, were marks that looked almost like symbols. They were too regular and deliberate to be natural, but they weren't quite recognizable as letters or numbers either. They had been carved deep into the wood, requiring considerable force and time. "James," I whispered, pointing to the nearest tree. He followed my gaze and went pale. "What do you think they mean?" "I don't know," I admitted. But the symbols filled me with a dread that I couldn't explain. They looked ancient, primitive, like some form of territorial marking or warning. We finished our lunch quickly and decided to turn back. The road ahead disappeared into thick forest, and neither of us felt comfortable venturing further into the unknown. But as we prepared to leave the clearing, I heard something that made my heart race. From somewhere deep in the woods, beyond the range of our vision, came a sound unlike anything I had ever heard. It started as a low rumble, almost like a growl, but it gradually rose in pitch until it became a howl that seemed to echo from multiple directions at once. The sound was neither fully animal nor human, but something in between. Something that spoke of intelligence and malice. "What was that?" James whispered, his face drained of color. I didn't answer because I didn't know, and I was afraid that any sound might attract whatever had made that terrible noise. We stood frozen in the clearing, listening as the howl faded into silence. But the quiet that followed was worse than the sound itself. It was the silence of a predator that had located its prey. When we finally found the courage to move, we discovered that we were being followed. Behind us, perhaps 100 yards back, branches were snapping and leaves were rustling as something large moved through the underbrush. Whatever it was made no effort to hide its presence. If anything, it seemed to be announcing itself, letting us know that it was there. We quickened our pace, but the sounds behind us matched our speed. When we jogged, it jogged. When we slowed down, it slowed down. It was toying with us, demonstrating that it could catch us whenever it chose to do so. "Don't look back," I whispered to James, though I was fighting the same urge. "Just keep walking." But the temptation was overwhelming. As we reached the fallen tree that blocked the road, I couldn't resist a quick glance over my shoulder. What I saw made my legs go weak. Standing at the edge of the clearing we had just left was a shape that defied easy description. It was tall, at least 7 feet, and covered in dark hair or fur. But it stood upright like a human, and its eyes, God, its eyes, reflected the dim forest light like mirrors. For a moment, those eyes locked with mine, and I saw something there that was far more terrifying than any wild animal. I saw intelligence, calculation, and something that looked disturbingly like amusement. "Run," I whispered to James, and we both scrambled over the fallen tree and began sprinting down the road. Behind us, the creature let out another of those terrible howls, but this time it was closer, much closer. We ran harder than I had ever run in my life, our feet pounding against the broken pavement as branches whipped at our faces and arms. The sounds of pursuit grew louder, not just footsteps now, but the crash of something large moving through the forest parallel to the road. We didn't stop running until we reached the boat launch, and even then we only paused long enough to untie the boat and push off from the dock. As James yanked the starter cord, I looked back at the tree line and saw movement in the shadows. Whatever had been following us was still there, watching from the safety of the forest. The boat engine roared to life, and we sped across the lake toward our island sanctuary. But as we reached the middle of the water, I realized with growing horror that we might not be heading toward safety at all. We might be heading toward a trap. The boat ride back to the island felt like an eternity. Every shadow on the water's surface looked like something moving beneath us, and I found myself constantly checking behind us to make sure we weren't being followed. The forest on both sides of the lake seemed to press closer, creating the illusion that the water was narrowing, funneling us towards some predetermined destination. James's hands shook as he steered the boat, and I could see the terror in his eyes. Neither of us spoke about what we had seen on the logging road. The creature, for lack of a better word, had been too impossible, too outside the realm of normal experience to discuss rationally. But it had been real. We had both seen it, and we both knew that it had been following us. As we approached our island, I noticed immediately that something was wrong. The cabin, which we had left with all the windows closed and doors locked, now showed signs of disturbance. The screen door hung partially open, moving gently in the breeze. One of the bedroom windows was open, though I was certain we had secured it before leaving. "Did we leave that window open?" James asked, his voice barely audible over the engine noise. "No," I replied, feeling my stomach drop. "We closed everything." We tied up the boat with unusual care, both of us reluctant to leave the relative safety of the water. The dock, which had felt solid and welcoming when we first arrived, now seemed exposed and vulnerable. The wooden planks creaked ominously under our feet, and I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched from the tree line. The path up to the cabin had been disturbed. Large footprints, the same ones we had seen on the logging road, were pressed into the soft earth, leading from the water's edge directly to our front door. But these prints were different from the ones we had found earlier. These were deeper, more deliberate, as if whatever had made them had been carrying something heavy. "It was here," James whispered, staring at the footprints. "While we were gone, it was here." I nodded, unable to speak. The implications were terrifying. Whatever that creature was, it had intelligence enough to know that we had left the island. It had used our absence to explore our temporary home, to learn about us, to perhaps prepare for our return. We approached the cabin with extreme caution, James grabbing a heavy piece of driftwood from the shore to use as a weapon. The front door was still locked, but the frame showed scratches where something had tested the strength of the wood. The screen door's mesh was torn in several places, as if large claws had raked across it. Inside, the cabin looked largely undisturbed, but there were subtle signs that someone or something had been there. A chair had been moved slightly. Cabinet doors that we had left closed were now ajar. Most disturbing of all, there was a smell. The same organic, unsettling odor I had detected when we first arrived, but now it was stronger, more concentrated. "We need to leave," James said, his voice tight with fear. "Right now." I wanted to agree, but the sun was already beginning to set, and the idea of navigating the lake in darkness felt even more dangerous than staying put. The creature had demonstrated that it could move through the forest as easily as we could move through our own home. If it could reach this island, it could certainly reach the mainland. "We'll leave first thing in the morning," I promised, "as soon as there's enough light." But as darkness fell over the lake, I began to question whether we would survive the night. The creature had been in our cabin. It knew where we slept, where we ate, where we felt safest. It had studied us, learned our routines, prepared for whatever it planned to do next. We barricaded the doors with furniture and checked every window to ensure they were locked. The bedroom window, the one that had been mysteriously opened, showed scratches on the sill that looked like they had been made by claws. Something had been trying to get in, or perhaps had already been inside and was trying to get out. "Maybe we should take turns keeping watch," James suggested. I agreed, though I doubted either of us would be able to sleep. The cabin, which had always been my sanctuary, now felt like a trap. The walls that had once provided security now seemed thin and vulnerable. Every creak of the old building, every gust of wind against the windows, every distant sound from the lake made us both freeze and listen. Around 10 o'clock, as we sat in the main room with all the lights on, we heard the first sound from outside. It was a scratching noise, like claws being dragged across wood. The sound moved slowly around the perimeter of the cabin, as if something was testing each wall, each window, each potential entry point. "It's circling the cabin," James whispered, his face pale in the lamplight. I nodded, too terrified to speak. The scratching continued for nearly an hour, sometimes stopping directly outside a window, sometimes moving to the deck, where the footsteps were clearly audible on the wooden planks. Whatever was out there was taking its time, studying the building, learning its weaknesses. Then suddenly, the sound stopped. The silence that followed was worse than any noise could have been. We sat frozen, straining to hear any indication of where the creature had gone. Minutes passed, then hours. But the quiet persisted, so complete that it felt unnatural. "Maybe it's gone," James said hopefully. I wanted to believe him, but something told me that the creature was still there, still watching, still waiting. It had learned patience, had developed a strategy. It was no longer simply following us. It was hunting us. At midnight, we heard the first sounds from the roof. Heavy footsteps moved across the metal surface, each step deliberate and careful. The creature was directly above us, separated only by a few inches of wood and insulation. I could hear it moving from one end of the cabin to the other, as if it was mapping the layout from above. "God help us," James whispered. The footsteps stopped directly over the bedroom where we would normally be sleeping. Something heavy settled onto the roof, and we could hear a scraping sound as if the creature was using its claws to test the strength of the metal. For several minutes it remained motionless, and I had the terrifying thought that it might be listening to us, learning our location by the sound of our breathing. Then, without warning, the footsteps resumed, moving toward the edge of the roof. We heard the creature descend, not down a ladder or along the walls, but in a single leap that shook the entire cabin. It had jumped from the roof to the ground, a distance of at least 12 feet, and landed with the grace of something that had made similar leaps countless times before. The silence that followed was absolute. We waited, barely breathing, for any sound that might indicate where the creature had gone. But there was nothing. It had vanished as quickly as it had appeared, leaving us alone with our terror and the growing certainty that it would return. We spent the rest of the night huddled together on the couch, taking turns at fitful sleep while the other kept watch. But dawn felt like it would never come, and I began to wonder if we would live to see another sunrise. Dawn arrived gray and cold, with a thick mist rising from the lake that reduced visibility to barely 50 feet. The fog seemed to cling to the island, creating an otherworldly atmosphere that made familiar landmarks appear strange and threatening. James and I had managed perhaps 2 hours of sleep between us, and we both looked haggard and exhausted. "We're leaving as soon as this fog lifts," I announced, though my voice lacked conviction. James nodded, but we both knew that the mist showed no signs of dissipating. If anything, it seemed to be growing thicker, as if the lake itself was conspiring to keep us trapped on the island. The water was invisible beyond the dock, and the mainland had disappeared entirely behind the gray veil. We spent the morning preparing for our departure, packing our belongings and securing the cabin. But as we worked, I became increasingly aware that we were being watched. The fog provided perfect camouflage for whatever was out there, and I caught glimpses of movement in the white curtain that surrounded us. "There," James whispered, pointing toward the tree line. "Did you see that?" I looked, but saw only shifting mist and shadows. But I trusted his instincts. We had both developed a heightened awareness of our surroundings that bordered on the supernatural. Something was out there, moving through the fog, circling our position like a predator sizing up its prey. The boat sat at the dock like a lifeline, but the idea of navigating the lake in zero visibility was terrifying. We could easily become lost, run aground, or worse, encounter whatever was hunting us in the open water where we would have no chance of escape. We wait for the fog to clear, I decided. We don't have a choice. But as the morning progressed, it became clear that the mist was not natural. It maintained a consistent thickness and showed no signs of being affected by the breeze or the warming sun. We were trapped, and whatever was out there knew it. The first direct confrontation came around noon. I was standing at the kitchen window, watching the fog for any sign of movement, when a massive shape materialized just beyond the glass. For a moment, I found myself face to face with the creature, separated only by a thin pane of glass and a few inches of space. It was even more terrifying up close. The face was vaguely human but distorted, with features that seemed to shift and change as I watched. The eyes were dark and intelligent, filled with a malevolence that made my blood freeze. But it was the expression on that face that truly terrified me. It was smiling, as if it knew something I didn't, as if it was enjoying my fear. "James," I whispered. But I couldn't look away from those eyes. The creature raised one massive hand and pressed it against the glass. The fingers were long and clawed, easily capable of punching through the window if it chose to do so. But it didn't break the glass. Instead, it simply stood there, watching me, letting me know that it could reach me whenever it decided to. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, the creature melted back into the fog. But its handprint remained on the glass, a dark smudge that looked disturbingly like blood. "It's playing with us," James said, his voice barely audible. "It could have broken in, but it didn't. It's enjoying this." I nodded, unable to speak. The creature wasn't just hunting us, it was tormenting us, drawing out our terror for its own amusement. We were trapped in a game where we didn't know the rules, and our opponent held all the advantages. The afternoon brought more encounters. Shapes moved through the fog around the cabin, sometimes approaching the windows, sometimes testing the doors. We could hear heavy breathing outside, the sound of claws scraping against wood, the occasional low rumble that might have been laughter. "Why doesn't it just attack?" James asked during one of the longer quiet periods. I had been wondering the same thing. The creature was clearly capable of breaking into the cabin. It had already demonstrated that it could move across the roof and leap from incredible heights, but it seemed to prefer psychological warfare to direct confrontation. "Maybe it's waiting for something," I suggested. "Maybe it has a plan." As if responding to my words, the sounds outside suddenly intensified. Heavy footsteps circled the cabin, but now they were accompanied by what sounded like multiple creatures. The fog seemed to be alive with movement, shapes shifting and darting just beyond the range of our vision. "There's more than one," James whispered, his face pale with terror. I pressed my ear to the wall and listened. He was right. There were at least 3, possibly more, moving through the mist around our shelter. They were coordinating their movements, working together like a pack of predators. We weren't just being hunted by one creature. We were being hunted by a group. The siege continued throughout the afternoon. The creatures took turns approaching the cabin, testing our defenses, probing for weaknesses. They scratched at the walls, rattled the windows, and climbed onto the roof where they moved around with deliberate, calculated steps. But they never tried to break in. They seemed content to wait, to let our fear build, to watch us slowly collapse under the psychological pressure. It was a strategy that was working. Both James and I were near our breaking point, jumping at every sound, seeing threats in every shadow. As evening approached, the fog began to thin slightly, revealing glimpses of the lake beyond. For a moment, I felt a surge of hope. If the mist cleared, we might have a chance to escape. But then I saw them. Dark shapes moving through the water, swimming in formation around the island. "They're in the water too," I told James, pointing toward the lake. We were completely surrounded. The creatures had cut off every possible escape route, trapping us on the island until they decided to end their game. The boat, which had represented our only hope of escape, was now unreachable. Even if we could fight our way to the dock, there was no guarantee that we could outrun the creatures in the water. Night fell with agonizing slowness, and with it came the realization that we might not survive until morning. The creatures had been patient during the day, but darkness would give them additional advantages. They could move unseen, coordinate their attacks, and pick us off whenever they chose. "We need a plan," James said, his voice hollow with exhaustion. I nodded, but I had no idea what we could do. We were outnumbered, outmatched, and completely cut off from help. The creatures had demonstrated intelligence, patience, and a level of coordination that suggested they had done this before. We were not their first victims, and we wouldn't be their last. As the final light faded from the sky, I heard something that made my heart stop. From somewhere in the fog, carried on the still air, came the sound of voices. Not animal growls or howls, but actual voices, low, guttural, and speaking in a language I didn't recognize. The creatures were communicating with each other, planning their next move. And as I listened to those alien voices in the darkness, I realized that we were about to discover exactly what they had been waiting for. The voices in the fog grew louder as full darkness settled over the lake. What I had initially taken for animal sounds were actually words. Guttural, primitive, but undeniably intelligent communication. The creatures were discussing us, debating our fate in a language that sounded like it hadn't been spoken by human tongues for thousands of years. "They're talking about us," James whispered, his face pressed against the living room window. I joined him, straining to understand the alien syllables that drifted through the mist. The voices came from multiple directions, suggesting that the creatures had positioned themselves around the cabin in a deliberate formation. They were no longer simply hunting us. They were conducting some kind of ritual, following a protocol that had been established long before we arrived on this island. The first test came just after midnight. A heavy thud against the front door made us both jump, followed by the sound of claws scraping against wood. But instead of trying to break through, the creature seemed to be carving something into the door's surface. The scraping continued for several minutes, creating a pattern that was too regular to be random. "It's marking the door," I realized. Like a symbol. James grabbed a flashlight and crept toward the entrance. Through the small window beside the door, he could see the creature's massive form hunched over its work. It was using its claws with surgical precision, creating deep gouges in the wood that formed a crude but recognizable pattern. "It looks like..." James paused, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. "It looks like a map." I moved closer to look. The creature had carved a rough outline of the island, complete with the cabin's location and what appeared to be markers indicating the positions of the other creatures. But most disturbing were the symbols carved around the perimeter. Symbols that looked exactly like the ones we had seen on the trees along the logging road. "They've been planning this," I said, the realization hitting me like a physical blow. The symbols in the forest, the empty lake, the fog, it's all connected. The creature finished its carving and moved away from the door, but not before pressing its face against the window. In the beam of James's flashlight, I could see its features clearly for the first time. It was humanoid, but wrong, as if evolution had taken a different path. The skull was elongated, the jaw too large, the eyes set too far apart. But it was the expression that terrified me most. It was looking at us with what could only be described as anticipation. Over the next hour, each of the creatures took turns approaching the cabin. They carved symbols into the walls, scratched patterns into the window frames, and left what appeared to be offerings on the deck, bones, stones, and other objects that I didn't want to examine too closely. They were preparing for something, following a ritual that had been performed before. We're part of their ceremony, I told James. We're not just prey, we're participants in something bigger. The thought made my skin crawl. These creatures hadn't simply wandered onto the island by accident. They had been waiting for us, or for people like us. The empty lake, the abandoned cabins, the mysterious disappearance of the other visitors. It all made sense now. We weren't their first victims. We were simply the latest in a long line of people who had been drawn to this place to serve some unknown purpose. Around 2 a.m, the voices outside began to change. The guttural communication was replaced by something that sounded almost like singing, a low rhythmic chanting that seemed to come from all directions at once. The fog began to glow with an eerie phosphorescence, creating ghostly shapes that danced around the cabin. "They're summoning something," James said, his voice barely audible. I nodded, though I didn't want to believe it. The chanting grew louder, more insistent, and with it came a sound that made my blood freeze. The splash of something large entering the water. Not one creature, but many, moving through the lake with purpose and intelligence. Through the bedroom window, I could see shapes moving in the illuminated fog. They were tall, humanoid figures that seemed to glide rather than walk. But these weren't the same creatures that had been stalking us. These were different. Older, more alien, with a presence that made the air itself feel thick and oppressive. "We need to get out of here," I whispered, though I knew it was impossible. The chanting reached a crescendo, and suddenly the entire cabin was surrounded by the new arrivals. They moved with a fluid grace that was hypnotic and terrifying, their forms shifting and changing as they circled our shelter. The original creatures, the ones that had been hunting us, seemed to step back, showing deference to these new entities. Then, without warning, the chanting stopped. The silence that followed was absolute, more oppressive than any sound could have been. The fog began to dissipate, revealing the full extent of our situation. We were surrounded by dozens of creatures, all standing motionless in the pale light that seemed to emanate from their bodies. "They're waiting for something," James observed. I was about to agree when I heard it, a sound that made my heart stop. From somewhere in the distance, carried across the water, came the unmistakable sound of a boat engine. Someone was approaching the island, heading directly into the trap that had been set for us. "Oh, God," I whispered. "There's someone else out there." The creatures heard it too. Their heads turned in unison toward the sound, and I could see the anticipation in their movements. They had been waiting for this moment, this completion of their ritual. We weren't their only targets. We were bait, used to draw others into their web. The boat grew closer, its engine echoing across the water. In the pale light, I could see it cutting through the fog, heading directly for our dock. The pilot couldn't possibly see the creatures waiting on the shore, couldn't know that they were sailing into a carefully orchestrated trap. "We have to warn them," I said, moving toward the door. James grabbed my arm. "We can't. We'll be killed the moment we step outside." He was right, but I couldn't stand by and watch innocent people sail into the same nightmare we were experiencing. I moved to the window and began flashing the lights, trying to signal the approaching boat. But the pilot either didn't see the warning or didn't understand its meaning. The boat continued its approach, the engine growing louder with each passing second. The creatures on the shore began to move, positioning themselves along the dock and the water's edge. They were preparing for the arrival of new victims, ready to begin the next phase of their terrible ritual. And there was nothing we could do to stop them. As the boat's headlight pierced the fog, illuminating the dock where the creatures waited, I realized that we were about to witness something that would haunt us for the rest of our lives, however long that might be. The boat's engine cut out just as it reached the dock, the sudden silence almost deafening after hours of mechanical noise. In the pale phosphorescent light that emanated from the creatures, I could see two figures in the boat, a man and a woman, both appearing to be in their 50s. They were laughing about something, completely oblivious to the dozens of entities watching them from the shadows. "We have to do something," I whispered to James. But we both knew there was nothing we could do without exposing ourselves to the same fate. The creatures remained motionless as the couple tied up their boat and began unloading what appeared to be camping gear. They moved with the casual confidence of people who had made this trip many times before, clearly familiar with the area. I wondered briefly if they were the owners of one of the other cabins, returning to check on their property. "Beautiful night for a boat ride," the woman said, her voice carrying clearly across the water. "The fog makes everything look so mysterious." Her companion chuckled as he shouldered a large backpack. "Mystery is good, gets the blood pumping." I wanted to scream at them to run, to get back in their boat and flee while they still could. But I knew that any sound from the cabin would only draw the creatures' attention to us. We were forced to watch in helpless terror as the two visitors walked directly into the trap. The first creature moved when the couple was halfway up the path to the cabin. It emerged from the tree line with fluid grace, cutting off their retreat to the dock. The man noticed it first, stopping so suddenly that his companion bumped into him. "What the hell is that?" he said, his voice no longer casual. The woman followed his gaze and went rigid. "That's not possible. That's not—" Her words were cut off as more creatures emerged from the fog. They formed a loose circle around the couple, moving with the same coordinated precision they had shown while stalking us. The man and woman pressed back to back, turning slowly to keep all the creatures in view. "Run," the woman whispered, though there was nowhere to go. The creatures began to close in, their movements deliberate and unhurried. They had done this before, had perfected their technique over years, or perhaps decades of practice. The couple was trapped just as surely as we were, caught in a web that had been laid long before they arrived. But then something unexpected happened. The man reached into his backpack and pulled out what appeared to be a flare gun. He fired it directly at the nearest creature, the bright red flame striking its chest and exploding in a shower of sparks. The entity staggered backward, its phosphorescent glow flickering momentarily. "The boat!" the man shouted to his companion. "Get to the boat!" They ran, pushing through the circle of creatures with desperate strength. The entities seemed stunned by the unexpected resistance, their careful choreography disrupted by the couple's refusal to submit quietly. For a moment it looked like they might actually escape. But the creatures recovered quickly. They pursued the fleeing couple with inhuman speed, their forms becoming more solid and threatening as they abandoned their hypnotic gliding for a more direct approach. The man fired his flare gun again, but the creatures had learned from the first shot and easily avoided the projectile. The woman reached the boat first, frantically working to untie the mooring lines while her companion held off the pursuing entities. But the creatures were too fast, too coordinated. They reached the dock just as the boat's engine roared to life. What happened next unfolded with horrible clarity in the pale light. The creatures didn't simply attack the couple. They began their ritual. The same guttural chanting that we had heard earlier filled the air. But now it was accompanied by sounds that I never want to hear again. The man's screams cut through the night like a blade, followed by the woman's pleas for mercy. "We can't just watch this," James said, his face pale with horror. But we were trapped by our own cowardice and the certainty that any intervention would only add us to the creature's victim count. We pressed our faces to the window, unable to look away from the nightmare unfolding on our dock. The ritual lasted for what felt like hours, though it was probably only minutes. The creatures performed their ceremony with practiced efficiency, their movements following a pattern that had been established long before we arrived. The couple's screams gradually faded, replaced by the same eerie silence that had preceded their arrival. When it was over, the creatures dispersed as quickly as they had gathered. They melted back into the fog, leaving behind only the evidence of what had occurred. The boat bobbed gently at the dock, its engine still running, but there was no sign of its former occupants. "They're gone," James whispered, though we both knew it was more than that. The couple hadn't simply been killed. They had been consumed, absorbed into whatever dark purpose the creatures served. The ritual had been completed, the sacrifice accepted, and now the entity's attention was turning back to us. The fog began to thicken again, and with it came the return of the creatures. They moved with renewed purpose, their earlier patience replaced by something that felt like hunger. The ritual with the couple had been an appetizer, a preparation for the main course. "Our turn," I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded. James nodded, his face set in grim determination. At least we know what we're facing now. But knowing what was coming didn't make it any easier to accept. The creatures were gathering around the cabin again, their phosphorescent glow creating an otherworldly light that seemed to pulse with the rhythm of a massive heart. They were no longer content to wait, no longer interested in psychological warfare. The hunt was about to begin in earnest, and we were running out of time to find a way to survive it. The creature's approach was different this time. Gone was the careful stalking, the psychological torment, the ritualistic circling. They moved with the confident stride of predators who had already worn down their prey, ready to claim their prize. The phosphorescent glow emanating from their bodies grew brighter, casting eerie shadows that danced across the cabin walls. "They're done playing," James said, his voice steady despite the terror in his eyes. I nodded, checking the makeshift barricades we had built around the doors and windows. Chairs, tables, and anything else we could move had been stacked against the entry points, but I knew it would only slow them down. These creatures had demonstrated intelligence, patience, and now they were showing their true power. The first impact came against the front door. The entire cabin shook as something massive struck the wooden barrier, sending our carefully constructed barricade sliding backward. A second blow followed, then a third. The creatures weren't trying to be subtle anymore. They were attempting to smash their way in through sheer force. "The back door," I called out, hearing similar sounds from the rear of the cabin. We were being attacked from multiple directions simultaneously. The creatures had learned the layout of our shelter during their earlier surveillance, and now they were exploiting every weakness. The windows rattled in their frames as claws scraped against the glass, probing for purchase. James grabbed a heavy cast-iron pan from the kitchen, while I found a baseball bat that had been left behind by previous visitors. We stood back to back in the center of the main room, watching as our defenses crumbled around us. The sounds of splintering wood and breaking glass filled the air. "Whatever happens," I said, "we don't give up. We fight until the end." The front door gave way first. The wooden frame splintered with a sound like thunder, and our barricade collapsed in a cascade of furniture. Through the opening, I could see the creatures pressed together, their eyes glowing with anticipation. But they didn't immediately pour through the breach. Instead, they seemed to be waiting for something. Then I understood. This wasn't just an attack. It was still part of their ritual. They were savoring this moment, drawing out our terror for their own purposes. The fear was as important to them as the final outcome. The largest creature stepped through the doorway, its massive form filling the entire opening. Up close, I could see details that made my skin crawl. Its skin wasn't quite flesh, but something that seemed to shift and change as I watched. The eyes were too large, too knowing, and they fixed on me with an intelligence that was both ancient and alien. "You have seen much," it said, its voice a low rumble that seemed to come from somewhere deep in its chest. You have witnessed the old ways, the proper ceremonies. You understand now what this place truly is. I was too shocked to respond. The creature could speak, could communicate in perfect English despite its obviously inhuman nature. It wasn't just an animal following instinct. It was something far more dangerous. This lake has been sacred for centuries, the creature continued, moving slowly into the cabin. Long before your people built their shelters here, we performed our rituals on these shores. You are guests in our domain, and guests must follow our customs. More creatures entered behind the first, forming a loose circle around us. They moved with the same fluid grace I had observed earlier, but now I could see the terrible purpose behind their movements. They weren't just hunting us, they were preparing us for something. The ritual requires willing participants, the creature explained. Those who understand their role, who accept their place in the ancient order. You have been tested, observed, judged worthy. You should feel honored. Go to hell, James said, raising his cast iron pan. The creature that had been speaking turned its attention to him, and I saw something that might have been amusement in its alien features. Your spirit is strong. That is good. The ceremony works best when the participants fight back. It moved faster than I would have thought possible. One moment it was standing across the room. The next it was looming over James, its massive hands reaching for him. He swung the pan with all his strength, connecting with the creature's head in a blow that would have felled any human. The creature barely noticed. It caught James by the throat and lifted him off the ground, holding him at eye level. For a moment they stared at each other. Predator and prey, ancient and modern, inhuman and human. Then the creature began to squeeze. I screamed and swung the baseball bat at the creature's back, putting every ounce of strength I possessed into the blow. The bat connected with a sound like hitting a tree trunk, but the creature didn't even turn around. It was focused entirely on James, who was struggling futilely against its grip. That's when I noticed the other creatures weren't participating in the attack. They were watching, observing, as if James's struggle was part of their entertainment. They wanted to see how long he could fight, how much resistance he could offer before succumbing to their power. But James had one advantage they hadn't counted on. The flare gun from the boat was still in his jacket pocket, and in his desperation, he managed to reach it. He pressed the barrel against the creature's chest and pulled the trigger. The flare exploded in a shower of sparks and flame, and for the first time, the creature showed genuine pain. It dropped James and staggered backward, its phosphorescent glow flickering like a dying light bulb. The smell of burning flesh filled the cabin, acrid and nauseating. Fire, I realized. They're vulnerable to fire. The other creatures seemed to understand this as well. They began to move with more urgency, their casual confidence replaced by something that might have been concern. James scrambled to his feet, still clutching the flare gun, and I noticed that the fireplace poker was within reach. "The fireplace!" I shouted, grabbing the poker and thrusting it into the dying embers of our earlier fire. "We need to get to the fireplace." But the creatures were already moving to cut us off. They formed a tighter circle, their movements more aggressive now that they understood we had found a weapon they feared. The injured creature was recovering, its wounds healing with unnatural speed, but it kept its distance from James and his flare gun. "One shot left," James said, checking the flare gun's chamber. "We need to make it count." I looked around the cabin, searching for anything that might help us. The propane tank for the stove was in the kitchen, but it was too far away. The oil lamp on the table was closer, but I'd need to get past two creatures to reach it. Then I remembered something from my childhood visits to this cabin. My grandfather had kept a cache of emergency supplies in the basement, including extra fuel for the boat. If we could get to the basement stairs, we might find something that could even the odds. "The basement," I told James. "There's fuel down there." He nodded, understanding immediately. We began to move toward the narrow staircase that led to the lower level, but the creatures anticipated our plan. They pressed closer, their alien features twisted with what might have been frustration. The largest creature spoke again, its voice now tinged with anger. You cannot escape the ritual. You cannot change what has been ordained. Accept your fate, and your passing will be swift. No, I said, surprised by the strength in my own voice. We won't be part of your ceremony. We won't be your victims. The creature's eyes narrowed, and I saw something dangerous flicker in their depths. Then you will die slowly, and your suffering will be all the greater. It lunged forward, and James fired his remaining flare directly into its face. The creature screamed, a sound that was barely recognizable as coming from any living thing, and stumbled backward. But even as it writhed in pain, the other creatures pressed their attack. We ran for the basement stairs, but I knew we wouldn't make it. The creatures were too fast, too coordinated, too determined. We had managed to wound one of them, but there were at least a dozen more, and they were no longer interested in playing games. As claws reached for my back and inhuman voices rose in triumph, I realized that our time had run out. The ritual was about to reach its conclusion, and we were powerless to stop it. But sometimes, when all hope seems lost, help arrives from the most unexpected sources. The sound of multiple boat engines roared across the water, accompanied by the brilliant beam of searchlights cutting through the fog. Human voices shouted commands, and the sharp crack of gunfire echoed across the lake. The creatures froze, their attention drawn to the new arrivals. For the first time since this nightmare began, they looked uncertain, almost afraid. The ritual had been interrupted, their carefully laid plans disrupted by an outside force they hadn't anticipated. "Search and rescue," James gasped, recognizing the organized nature of the response. "Someone must have reported us missing." The creatures began to retreat, their phosphorescent glow fading as they melted back into the fog. But their leader, the one James had wounded, turned back to us one final time. "This is not over," it said, its voice carrying clearly despite the sounds of the approaching rescue team. "The ritual will be completed. If not with you, then with others. This place remembers, and we are patient." Then they were gone, vanishing into the mist as if they had never existed at all. James and I stood alone in the ruined cabin, surrounded by evidence of our ordeal, but with no proof of what had really happened. The rescue team found us 20 minutes later, huddled together on the dock and clearly in shock. They had been searching for the missing couple whose boat had been found drifting empty on the lake. They asked us questions about what we had seen, but how could we explain creatures that spoke in ancient tongues and glowed with their own light? We told them about strange sounds in the night, about feeling watched, about our decision to leave the island. The officials accepted our story, attributing our terror to the stress of being lost in the fog and the shock of finding the abandoned boat. But I knew the truth. The creatures were still out there, still performing their rituals, still waiting for their next victims. The lake would remain empty for a while, but eventually, new visitors would arrive. People who didn't know the history of this place, who couldn't read the warnings carved into the trees. As the rescue boat carried us back to the mainland, I looked back at the island one final time. The fog was clearing, revealing the cabin in the pale light of dawn. For just a moment, I thought I saw shapes moving among the trees, watching our departure. The ritual would continue, I knew. The creatures would wait and plan, and eventually, they would find new participants for their ancient ceremony. But it wouldn't be us. We had survived, and we would never return to Lake Mistral. Some places are meant to remain empty, meant to be left alone. This was one of them, and I pray that others will heed the warnings we were too stubborn to recognize. The old ways are still practiced in the remote corners of the world, and some traditions are too terrible to be allowed to continue. But stopping them would require more than just avoiding the places where they occur. It would require confronting the creatures that perform them, and that is a task I am not brave enough to undertake. All I can do is share this story and hope that others will learn from our mistakes. The wilderness is vast and beautiful, but it is also home to things that should not be disturbed. We learned that lesson the hard way, and we were lucky to survive the teaching. The next time you hear stories about missing people in remote locations, about boats found drifting empty on isolated lakes, about campers who vanish without a trace, remember what happened to us. Remember that some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some places are better left unvisited. The creatures are still out there, still waiting, still performing their ancient rituals, and they are far more patient than we could ever be. My name is Ethan, and I'm 28 years old. I live in a small apartment in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where I work as a freelance graphic designer. It's not the most lucrative career, especially with the inconsistent work lately. Money has been really tight, and the financial stress has been weighing on me heavily. That's why when my old college buddies, Mark and Jason, suggested a camping trip to get away from it all for a few days, I jumped at the chance. We hadn't seen each other in a couple years since I moved away from Michigan, where we grew up. A reunion was long overdue. "It'll be just like old times," Mark had said on the phone. "We'll head up to that same spot in the UP that we used to go to in college. Drink some beers around the fire, go fishing, not worry about work or money or any of that crap for a while." It sounded perfect. Like most outdoorsy Midwestern guys, camping and hiking were second nature to us. We'd spent countless weekends in the dense woods of northern Michigan and the vast wilderness of the Upper Peninsula. Escaping into nature always helped clear my head. I threw some supplies and gear into my old pickup truck and made the 8-hour drive north. The familiar sight of towering pines and the fresh, earthy scent of the forest immediately soothed my frayed nerves as I pulled into the remote campground. Mark and Jason had already arrived and were setting up the tents. We greeted each other with bear hugs and cracked open cold beers as we got the fire going. The sky darkened, stars blanketed the night, and the only sounds were the crackling flames and crickets chirping. I felt more relaxed than I had in months. But there was something else, an unsettling feeling creeping up my spine that I couldn't quite place. The shadows seemed to flicker ominously just beyond the reach of the firelight. A distant animal cry echoed from deep in the woods, sending a chill through me despite the warm August air. I shook it off, blaming an overactive imagination and one too many beers. If only I had listened to my instincts that night. The next morning dawned crisp and cool. Mist drifted between the trees and dew sparkled on the grass. Mark was already up, prodding the smoldering embers of last night's fire. "Dude, did you hear those crazy animal sounds last night?" I asked, pouring myself a cup of the strong camp coffee. "What do you think that was? A wolf, maybe?" Mark shrugged. "Could be. They've started repopulating this area in recent years. Or maybe a coyote." "I thought I heard something moving around out there too. Probably just a raccoon or something," I said. "You worry too much, man. We're in the middle of nowhere, nothing out here but us and the wildlife. Although..." Mark trailed off. "What?" He hesitated. "Nah, never mind. Just an old campfire story. Forget I mentioned it." I was intrigued now. "Come on, don't hold out on me. What story?" Mark sighed and glanced at Jason, who was still snoring softly in the tent. He lowered his voice to almost a whisper. "There's an old Native American legend about a creature that supposedly lives in these woods. The Ojibwe people called it the wendigo. It was once a man, a hunter, but one brutally cold winter his entire family starved to death. In desperation, hunger drove him mad and he ate them. Consumed by an insatiable greed and bloodlust, the wendigo now wanders the forests searching for new victims." I let out a low whistle. "Damn, that's dark. Good thing it's just a legend, right?" Mark didn't meet my eyes. "Yeah, just a legend," he said, but he didn't sound convinced. Just then, Jason emerged yawning from the tent, breaking the tension. What's the plan for today, boys? I was thinking we could hike over to that old fishing spot we found last time, I suggested. The one with the waterfall and the big flat boulders perfect for sunbathing. They readily agreed, and after a quick breakfast, we headed out, Mark leading the way with his GPS. The deeper we trekked into the dense wilderness, the more uneasy I felt. It was deathly silent, with none of the usual bird songs or insect noises you'd expect. About 2 hours into our hike, I spotted something that made my blood run cold. Hanging from a tree branch just off the path was some sort of charm or talisman. A bundle of bones, fur, and feathers bound together with frayed rope. Guys, I called out nervously. You might want to see this. Mark and Jason backtracked to where I was standing, staring up at the grotesque ornament. Jason let out a low whistle. What the hell is that thing? He asked. No idea, but I don't like it, I muttered. Looks like some kind of twisted voodoo shit. Mark stepped closer to inspect it, brow furrowed. He reached out a tentative hand to touch the bones. Don't, I said sharply. You don't know what kind of bad juju that thing might have. Mark shot me an incredulous look. Seriously? You really believe in that superstitious crap? I shrugged helplessly. I don't know, man. But after that wendigo story you told, I'd rather not take any chances. That reminds me, Jason chimed in. I've heard about sightings of that creature around here before, from a cousin of mine. He swears his buddy encountered it while hunting these woods years ago. Not you too, Mark said, shaking his head. I shouldn't have even brought it up. There's no such thing as a wendigo. I'm not saying there is, Jason replied. But you gotta admit there's something off about this forest. It feels wrong somehow. An icy trickle of dread crept down my spine as I glanced around at the two quiet trees towering over us. Maybe it was just my imagination running wild, but the woods suddenly seemed more sinister, more watchful. Every snapped twig or rustle of leaves made my pulse spike. Let's just keep moving, I said gruffly, shouldering my pack. The sooner we get to the fishing spot, the better. We continued on in uneasy silence, unconsciously hurrying our pace. The forest seemed to close in around us, shadows deepening despite the midday sun. The canopy of leaves grew so thick that only the barest slivers of light penetrated through. I nearly jumped out of my skin when a sudden high-pitched shriek pierced the oppressive stillness. We froze in our tracks, exchanging alarmed glances. What the fuck was that? Jason hissed. The shriek came again, closer this time, followed by the unmistakable sound of snapping branches and heavy footfalls. Something large was moving through the brush just out of sight, circling us. Guys, I whispered hoarsely, my mouth bone dry. A hulking shape exploded out of the undergrowth, a massive brown bear, rearing up on its hind legs with a furious roar. We scattered in opposite directions as it charged. I've never run so fast in my life, pure adrenaline propelling me through the trees. Branches whipped at my face and tore at my clothes as I sprinted blindly. Behind me, I could hear the bear crashing through the forest, Jason's terrified shouts urging me on. I risked a panicked glance over my shoulder and my heart nearly stopped. The bear had given up chasing me and Jason. It was after Mark. Mark! I screamed, skidding to a halt and whirling around. But I had lost sight of both him and the bear in the dense undergrowth. Jason crashed into me from behind, panting heavily. Where is he? Jason gasped out. I don't know, I lost him. That bear, it was chasing him. A blood-curdling scream ripped through the air, followed by a ferocious roar. My stomach turned to ice. Mark was in trouble. Jason and I charged back the way we came, following the sound of thrashing and snarls. We burst into a small clearing, and a scene from a nightmare greeted us. Mark was on the ground, the huge grizzly towering over him. Crimson blood stained its muzzle. Mark wasn't moving. "Hey!" I bellowed, grabbing a large rock and hurling it at the bear. It bounced off its thick hide harmlessly, but got the beast's attention. It swung its massive head toward us and let out an enraged growl. Jason pulled out the large hunting knife he always carried and brandished it with shaking hands. I desperately cast about for a weapon of my own and settled on a sturdy fallen branch. We shouted and waved our arms, trying to appear as large and intimidating as possible. The bear hesitated, glancing between us and Mark's prone form, as if deciding which would be easier prey. "Come on, you ugly bastard!" I snarled through gritted teeth. "Come and get us!" For a heart-stopping moment, I thought it would charge. But to my immense relief, it gave a final snort of frustration and lumbered off into the brush. We waited until it was out of sight before sprinting to Mark's side. "Mark! Oh God, Mark, talk to me!" I babbled, dropping to my knees beside him. His shirt was torn and bloody, deep gashes marring his chest and shoulders where the bear's claws had rent his flesh. But miraculously, his eyes fluttered open. "Holy shit," he croaked. "That was way too close." Jason gave a strained bark of laughter as we carefully helped Mark sit up. Understatement of the century, dude. I think I aged 10 years in the last 10 minutes. My head swam with relief that he was alive, but also rising panic. We were hours into the backcountry with an injured man and no supplies except what we had in our day packs. And that bear was still out there somewhere. "We need to get him back to camp, fast," I said grimly. "Can you stand?" Mark gritted his teeth against the pain and nodded. He looked pale and clammy, his shirt already soaked with blood. I just prayed the bear hadn't severed an artery. Slinging Mark's arms over our shoulders, Jason and I half carried, half dragged him back the way we came as quickly as his wounds allowed. But with every step, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the increasingly menacing woods. Something ancient and evil and hungry. After what seemed like an eternity, we stumbled back into camp on rubbery legs. The sight of our tents and the ashy remains of the fire almost made me weep with relief. As Jason set about cleaning and dressing Mark's injuries with our meager first aid kit, I busied myself building the fire back up, needing the comforting light and warmth to chase away the dread. The sun was rapidly sinking and the temperature dropping. I sank down next to Mark, exhaustion hitting me like a freight train. "I think we should cut this trip short and head into town first thing tomorrow. Get you to a clinic." He nodded wearily, wincing as Jason tied off a bandage. "No arguments here. I've had enough of nature for a while." I huffed out a humorless chuckle. "You and me both." We decided to sleep in shifts, one of us always keeping watch for the bear's return. Despite my bone-deep fatigue, I volunteered to go first. There was no way I'd be able to rest easy anyway. Not with the memory of that hideous bone talisman and the Wendigo legend still rattling around my brain. Gripping my hatchet tightly, I feeding twigs to the fire and stared out into the gathering darkness, trying to convince myself the flickering shadows were just trees. Wondering what other horrors might be lurking, waiting for their chance to strike. I must have dozed off at some point, because the next thing I knew, Jason was shaking me awake. The fire had burned down to embers, and the night pressed in close and menacing. "Dude, wake up," he urged in a harsh whisper. "Do you hear that?" I rubbed blearily at my eyes, straining my ears. At first, all I could hear was the usual chorus of crickets and peeper frogs. But then another sound reached me. A rhythmic thudding that seemed to reverberate through the ground itself. Slow, lumbering footsteps. And they were getting closer. I leapt to my feet, hatchet at the ready, my heart in my throat. "The bear?" I croaked. Jason shook his head, eyes wide. "I don't think so. This sounds bigger." We stared out into the suffocating darkness, Mark struggling to sit up on his bedroll. The footsteps grew louder, twigs snapping like gunshots in the stillness. An ungodly stench hit me then, like rotting flesh and decay. I gagged, covering my mouth and nose. Mark retched behind me. The thudding stopped. Oppressive silence fell. I hardly dared to breathe. And then I saw it. 2 points of eerie green light glowed in the shadows just beyond the reach of the firelight. Eyes, I realized with sinking horror. They blinked, then disappeared as if the thing had turned its head. Heavy footfalls retreated back into the forest. For a moment, none of us moved, too shocked and terrified to process what we'd just witnessed. "Please tell me that was a bear," Mark said in a thin, reedy voice. "There's no way," I replied grimly. "Did you smell that stench? And those eyes?" "We need to leave," Jason cut in urgently. "Right now. Screw waiting for daylight. I'm not spending another minute in these god-forsaken woods." He didn't have to tell me twice. We broke camp in record time, throwing gear haphazardly into our packs and hauling a groaning Mark to his feet. The darkness felt viscous, cloying, as if it was deliberately trying to bog us down. The hike back to the road where we'd parked was a waking nightmare. Every snapped twig or owl hoot made us flinch and whirl around wildly. The stink of decay lingered at the edges of my awareness. I almost wept when the blessed sight of my pickup came into view. We piled in and I floored it, gravel spraying as I sped off down the dirt track. I white-knuckled the steering wheel the whole way to the tiny local clinic, convinced that every shadow flitting across the road was that creature coming for us. It wasn't until the exhausted-looking night nurse assured us Mark's injuries were painful, but not life-threatening, that I finally started to breathe again. Safely ensconced in a shabby motel room with the first rays of dawn lightening the sky, the whole thing felt like a bad dream. The product of overactive imaginations, spooky stories, and the disorienting blackness of the deep forest at night. At least that's what I kept telling myself. But I couldn't shake the image of those malevolent green eyes boring into my soul. And some small, primitive part of my brain knew with gut-wrenching certainty that the wendigo was real. That death had stalked us in those woods, and only dumb luck had allowed us to escape. I haven't set foot in the wilderness since that night, and I doubt I ever will again. The forest no longer feels like a sanctuary to me, but something older, darker, and more twisted than I ever could have imagined. There are things out there in the shadows that we aren't meant to see. Horrors that have existed long before man first crawled out of the primordial ooze. And sometimes, when the veil between our worlds wears thin, they reach out with grasping claws to drag us into the abyss. 2 months later, I sat hunched at my drafting table, staring blearily at the magazine layout on my computer screen. My shoulders were cramped, my eyes dry and gritty. A sudden ping from my phone made me jump. For a heart-stopping second, I was back in those woods, tensed for the sound of snapping branches under monstrous feet. Then my surroundings registered. The hum of the elderly AC unit, the squeak of my chair, afternoon light slanting across my desk. I let out a shaky breath and swiped open the text from Jason. My brow furrowed as I read it once, then again. "Have you seen the news about those missing hikers in Oregon? The ones who were camping in the Mint Hood National Forest? They found their gear all torn up and scattered, but no sign of the bodies. Creepy stuff, man. Reminded me of our own close call. Think it could be related?" A chill crept down my spine as I stared at the words on the small screen. Jason wasn't one for conspiracy theories or paranormal nonsense, so for him to even suggest such a thing meant he must have been seriously rattled. With trembling fingers, I pulled up a news article about the missing hikers. The details were unsettlingly sparse. A group of 3 friends, experienced outdoorsmen, had set off for a week-long trek in the Mount Hood wilderness. When they failed to return, a search party was dispatched, only to find a scene of chilling chaos at their last known campsite. The tent had been shredded to ribbons, sleeping bags torn open and strewn about as if a bomb had gone off. Food canisters were found 100 yards away, lids ripped off, contents spilling across the forest floor. Of the hikers themselves, not a single trace remained, not even tracks, like they had simply been plucked out of existence. Authorities suspected a bear attack or perhaps a cougar, but no animal could have caused such destruction without leaving some sign behind. And that still didn't explain how 3 grown men skilled in the outdoors could have vanished into thin air without so much as a scrap of clothing or a drop of blood left behind. I thought again of those eerie green eyes in the woods, boring into my soul with ancient, insatiable hunger. The ungodly reek of death and decay. A shudder worked through me and I had to set the phone down, my hands shaking too badly to type. Deep down, in a primordial part of my brain that knew to fear the dark, I was certain that whatever stalked Jason, Mark, and I that night had claimed new victims in Oregon. That the Wendigo's hunting grounds stretched far beyond the forests of the northern Midwest. How long had this thing, this abomination, walked the earth, preying on the unwary? Were there others like it, sleeping in their foul dens across the country, waiting for hapless campers to stumble into their territory? The questions spun in my mind, chasing each other like snarling beasts until a headache bloomed behind my eyes. I didn't want to know the answers. Suddenly, all I wanted was to be as far from trees and dirt and the inky blackness between the stars as I could get. I shut off my phone, not bothering to text Jason back, and returned to my design work with single-minded focus, desperate for the distraction. But a yawning pit had opened in my gut, an existential dread that writhed and whispered in my ear. "You aren't safe," it hissed. "You can't unsee what you saw. You can't unknow the truth. And one day, one night, when you let your guard down, it will come for you too." The dream is always the same. I'm back in the forest, running through the suffocating darkness, breath burning in my lungs and terror scorching my veins. Trees loom on all sides, grasping at me with skeletal branches. The Wendigo is out there in the shadows, coming for me. I can hear its footsteps booming like war drums, feel its fetid breath on the back of my neck. No matter how fast I run, how desperately I push my battered body, it's never enough. Icy talons close around my ankle, wrenching me off my feet, dragging me back into its dripping jaws ringed with needle teeth. I open my mouth to scream and I bolt upright in bed, chest heaving, sweat cooling on my skin. For a disoriented moment, I thrash against tangled sheets, convinced they're the Wendigo's clammy grip. Then reality seeps back in. My bedroom, bathed in the sickly orange glow of the streetlight outside. The distant wail of a siren. The stale smell of cigarette smoke from the neighbors downstairs. I sag back against the mattress, boneless with relief, and glance at the clock. 3:33 a.m. It blinks at me, mockingly. Always that same devilish hour. It's been 6 months since our ill-fated camping trip, and the nightmares haven't stopped. If anything, they're getting more frequent, more visceral. Some nights, I swear I can taste the rot of the creature's breath on the back of my tongue when I wake. Resigned to another stretch of sleepless hours until dawn, I pad out to the kitchen and put on a pot of coffee with shaking hands. My reflection in the microwave door gives me pause. Bloodshot eyes sunk in bruised sockets, sallow skin, unkempt stubble. The fluorescent light hums and flickers as I slump at the dinette with my mug. Thousands of worries chasing each other in my mind. How long can I keep going on like this? Hollow-eyed and twitchy, tormented by memories of that thing in the dark. Will this be my life now? Forever stuck in the liminal space between waking and nightmare? Those hikers in Oregon were never found. They joined the ranks of the vanished dozens, the mysteriously disappeared. More have gone missing in the intervening months, all over the country. Appalachia, the Ozarks, the remote wildernesses of Northern California and Washington. I've become obsessed, spending hours falling down internet rabbit holes, reading every scrap of lore and legend I can find on the Wendigo, on creatures that match its description. I know on some level that I'm courting madness with this fixation, that I'm not going to like what I find at the bottom of this awful barrel of secrets. But I can't stop. That's the insidious thing about brushing up against true dread, about learning the kinds of truths we beg to forget. Once you open Pandora's box, you can't cram the whispering chaos back inside. So here I sit, night after night, surrounded by the blue glow of my laptop and the bitter smoke of my cigarette, chasing mysteries for which I don't truly want answers. Mysteries that might consume me long before any monster's jaws ever could. Staring into the black mirror of the kitchen window and wondering, always wondering, if those green eyes are staring back. It's been a year since that disastrous night in the North Woods changed everything. Since I looked into the abyss and felt it looking back. I had to get out of Pittsburgh, away from the clutter and the noise and the light pollution that paradoxically only made the shadows feel deeper, more treacherous. As if all that buzz and glow was just a camouflage, a flimsy curtain drawn over yawning maw of the dark. So I headed west to the mountains of Colorado. Not ideal, perhaps, for someone trying to escape their fear of the wild places. But I needed room to breathe, and there's nothing like the thin air and sprawling vistas of the Rockies for that. I found work at a local print shop, a far cry from my cutthroat advertising career, but uncomplicated in a way I desperately craved. And slowly, I started putting my fractured self back together. There are still nights when I wake up soaked in icy sweat, biting back screams. Still times when a flash of green from a traffic light or a stray whiff of something foul sends me right back to that foul clearing. I don't know if those scars will ever fade entirely, but I'm learning to muffle my panicked brain, to reason through my fears. I remind myself that whatever stalks the forests can't reach me here, nestled amid the bustle and light of civilization. That if I just keep moving, keep looking forward, I can outrun the nightmares snapping at my heels. I talk to Mark and Jason often, more than we ever did before that night bound us together in terrible knowledge. They're doing better too, or at least they're getting good at pretending. We don't talk about what happened, about the missing people that made the news for a month or two before fading back into obscurity. But it's there between the lines, an invisible thread tying us to each other. Sometimes I wonder if I dreamed it all. If my tired, stressed-out mind just conjured a monster from campfire tales and shadows. But then I remember those eyes, that stench, the bone-deep visceral certainty that I was in the presence of something ancient and cold and utterly inhuman. You don't imagine a feeling like that. You sure as hell don't forget it. So I keep my head down and my feet moving, and I cling to the daylight like a charm against evil. And on the nights when that acrid phantom smell comes creeping back into my nose, I remind myself of all the miles and mountains between me and those fathomless woods. It's a thin comfort, but it's all I have. Because deep in the back of my mind, I know the truth. I may have escaped the wendigo's claws, but I'll never be free of the scars it left on my soul. I've seen the face of true darkness, and it's out there still, waiting patiently in the spaces between the trees, watching, hungering, biding its time until the stars align and the barriers thin and some other poor doomed souls wander into its mossy domain, unaware that they're already damned.